Erbarme dich, mein Gott, from the St. Matthew Passion, is one of Johann Sebastian Bach's most famous arias. It's also one of his most difficult. Much, if not most, of Bach's music, however, is often considered difficult to sing, in large part because Bach treats the voice differently than did later composers. So in this video, I want to share with you 8 things that you need to know in order to sing Bach better. This is not a video about vocal technique, but as someone who's worked extensively with singers, as a collaborative pianist, as a vocal and opera coach, and as a choral accompanist, in addition to being a harpsichordist and continuo player, I want to give you a body of knowledge about Bach's music that will help you sing it better. We'll look particularly at the aria Erbarme dich, mein Gott, but everything I'll cover can be applied to all of Bach's vocal music. Let's dig in. Number 1. Bach didn't think of the voice in the way that a lot of other composers did. In his music, the singers are treated the same way as the instrumentalists, and I mean this literally. The musical material in the vocal lines of his arias is almost always derived from, and often identical to, musical material found in the instrumental parts. This is in large part because of how Bach constructs his arias in ritornello form, and how he typically works out that structure. I'm going to make a video in the future all about how Bach uses ritornello forms in his vocal music, so subscribe if you're interested in finding out when that video comes out, or if you're just interested in learning more about Baroque and Renaissance music. But for now, we'll just look at the very basics of how Bach uses ritornello form. In Erbarme dich, mein Gott, as in most all of Bach's other arias, the material in the opening ritornello, in this case what's played by the solo violin, bum ba-da-dum ba-dum bium ba-dum bum, is the same material that the voice begins with. In Erbarme dich, the voice quickly moves on to other material, but frequently returns later to other musical lines from the opening ritornello. This is in keeping with how Bach typically writes arias, and so it is important to recognize how Bach treats the voice as similar to and equal to, rather than more important than, the other instrumental members of the ensemble. This is a different relationship between voice and instruments than is found in much other music. Take, for example, any Lied by Robert Schumann, and you'll quickly see that the piano and voice tend to play distinctly different roles and usually share much less musical material. Number 2. Understanding the size of the ensemble for which Bach was writing is also essential to understanding how his arias work. Unlike many modern performances today, the original forces for Bach's vocal works were small, most likely only 1 to a part, except for the violins, which were 4 in number, 2 first violins and 2 second violins. Even for large works, such as the St. Matthew Passion, which had 2 orchestras and from which the aria Erbarme dich, mein Gott is drawn, the original performance in 1727 had likely very small forces, possibly only 4 violins split between the 2 orchestras, 1 on each part in each orchestra, and fewer than 20 instrumentalists in total. Even for performances of the work in later years of Bach's tenure in Leipzig, there would have still been very small forces and fewer than 30 instrumentalists that performed the work. And in the aria Erbarme dich, as in most of Bach's arias, the forces are much more sparse. Even the parts from the larger 1736 performance indicate the use of only 4 violins, 1 viola, and probably 3 continuo players. This means that difficulties of balance often faced today between the orchestra and the singer were most likely non-existent or at most minimal, and the vocalist would not have needed to focus on projection as a means to cut through the orchestral sound. The ensemble was not at odds with the singer, but instead they were equals and their musical materials intertwined as such. This brings us to a necessary discussion of who actually sang Bach's soprano and alto arias, including Erbarme dich. At the time Bach was writing his sacred music, which was intended for and used in church services and not in any sort of concert setting, women were not allowed to sing music that was written for the Lutheran church services. This meant that all the vocal parts were sung by men and boys, including Bach's soprano and alto arias, and Bach's singers in Leipzig were drawn from the student population of the St. Thomas Boys' School, where Bach taught. Now, I'm certainly not advocating for performances of Bach's music that don't include women. it was sexism that kept women out of church music, and I absolutely think that women should sing Bach's music today. Bach himself was even reprimanded during his tenure in Arnstadt for bringing a woman, possibly his cousin and future wife Maria Barbara Bach, into the choir loft there to sing. So I think that women, as well as countertenors and boys, should all be welcome to sing Bach's vocal music. But I wanted to make the point that many of Bach's vocal lines were written with young male voices in mind, though the definition of young at that time period could actually probably go up to around 20 in some cases, because puberty happened much later during that era. Number 4 deals with picking a good and singable tempo based on what we know about tempos and metrical markings from the late Baroque period. Because of an often poor understanding of how metrical and other tempo markings in the Baroque period differ from how we understand them today, many of Bach's arias tend to be taken at slow tempos that make them more difficult to sing than they need to be. This definitely includes the aria Erbarme dich, mein Gott, where earlier 20th century interpretations often take the piece much slower than more modern, historically informed performances. Take, for example, the recordings you can find on YouTube by Julia Hamari versus Delphine Galou. I'll put links in the description below for both of those. Older recordings tend to take the piece much slower and even beat 12/8 notes to each measure, since the metrical marking is 12/8. But in the Baroque period, 12/8 was not a slow meter and would most certainly have been felt with 4 large beats to the bar instead of feeling each of those 12/8 notes. In the era Bach was writing music, note values had a much more specific relationship to tempo than they do today. And so the note values that composers chose tell us a lot about what tempo they intended a piece to go. So arias such as Erbarme dich, mein Gott, which are written in compound meters, should definitely be felt in large beats. And for arias written in non-compound meters, such as 4/4 or 3/4, you should always be aware of where the strong and weak parts are of each measure, usually with the downbeat being the strongest. And so you should choose a tempo where the strong beats remain strong, but the other beats can be lighter, not a slow tempo in which all the beats are felt equally and the music gets too bogged down or too beaty. Number 5, make sure that you write in a literal word-for-word translation anytime that you're working on one of Bach's arias. If you're a singer or a collaborative pianist or continuo player, you should already be doing this for all of your music. But I wanted to show you specifically how important it is for Bach's arias because of how he tends to use text painting in his music. In Erbarme dich, for example, almost every time the text speaks of my tears, the line becomes very chromatic. And when the vocalist sings the word bitterly, the musical line suddenly makes a large leap downwards, bringing brief angularity and distress to the music. Bach frequently reflects the texts in this way in his musical settings, putting words such as Ewigkeit, which means eternity, on long held notes or with long melismatic passages, or setting words such as Flug, which means flight, with fast moving notes. Always be aware of what every single word literally means. A poetic translation is not good enough. Number 6. In the Baroque period, and really in all eras before the 20th century, A did not always equal 440 Hz. Check out my video on historical pitches if you want to learn more. But what you need to know here is that most of Bach's vocal works were written during his tenure in Leipzig, where they would have been sung at about A415, which is approximately a half step or semitone lower than our modern pitch of A440. This frequently makes the ranges of Bach's arias fit better in the voice, particularly in the case of tenor arias, which tend to sit quite high. But it is something that should be considered by all vocalists when they are preparing music by Bach. Number 7. If you're singing Bach's music, it's important to know what happened to him and his music after his death, and how he became so famous today, because it relates directly to how singers and their teachers tend to approach Bach's music. Bach was not really famous during his lifetime, and after his death he was mostly forgotten, at least in the general population. Some musicians and composers kept Bach's music alive in the underground, however, and in 1829 Felix Mendelssohn organized a performance of the St. Matthew Passion in Berlin. This performance was a big success, and it brought Bach's music back into the public eye. But 19th century musicians, including Mendelssohn, were interested in imbuing Bach's music with the aesthetics and ideals of the Romantic era, instead of performing Bach's works the way he had conceived of and heard them himself. It was these musical ideas from the Romantic period that in large measure influenced how Bach's music was performed from then on, until the relatively recent early music movement in the second half of the 20th century. I'm going to be creating a future video all about the early music movement, so subscribe if you're interested in learning more about that. So this is why tempos are often slow and ensembles large in the performances of Bach's music even today, despite that this was not what the composer had in mind at all. Getting back to Bach's original ideas usually makes the music easier to sing and easier to understand. And finally, number 8. Since I spent a lot of this video talking about things you shouldn't do or things I think you should possibly reconsider, I wanted to end this video by giving you some practical advice about how I think you should approach Bach's music. If you're going to be doing Bach arias with piano, I recommend using the chorus edition, which I find to be the most accurate while still being playable. If you can't get your hands on the chorus, try looking for some Bärenreiter editions, which are also quite reliable, though usually have thicker textures and can be somewhat more difficult to play. Bärenreiter editions often tend to have what I consider to be too florid of ornamentation in arias that only have continuo accompaniment, called continuo arias, which is one of the main reasons I prefer the chorus edition over the Bärenreiter. If at all possible, stay away from the free 19th century piano vocal editions of the cantatas that are on IMSLP. Your pianist or harpsichordist will definitely thank you later. Those editions are usually very complicated to play and sometimes flat out impossible, and there are usually many added anachronistic markings that will lead you in the wrong direction with Bach's music. If you're doing a Bach aria with piano, you can also consider taking the piece down a half step so that the vocal line is at the same pitch level as was the original. This can often create difficult keys for the pianist to play in, however, so if you're interested in going this route, pay someone to write the music down a half step, or do it yourself using musical notation software. If you'll be learning or performing your Bach aria with an experienced harpsichordist or a period instrument ensemble, I would recommend using the Neue Bach-Ausgabe, which is currently the most reliable edition for Bach's music in full score. For Bach's vocal works, you can also generally use the Bach Gesellschaft edition that's free on IMSLP. It's a 19th century edition, but its makers were very concerned with replicating what was in Bach's original parts, at least those that they had access to, and for the vocal works, it is an okay source to use. This is, however, not necessarily true for some of Bach's other works, such as his solo keyboard pieces. I would also highly recommend seeking out and listening to performances that use period instruments. You can tell which recordings these are because they'll be at A415, which in most cases was the original pitch of Bach's vocal works. And the bowed string players will be using what's called a Baroque bow, which curves outwards and is tapered at the end, instead of a modern tort bow. Some modern orchestras do use Baroque bows but modern instruments, however, to try and replicate Baroque sound, but period instruments are always better for this purpose since they are replicas of the original instruments themselves. Such period instrument recordings will give you the best clues to tempo and to general interpretation in terms of Bach's original ideas. Okay, that's all for today. Please subscribe to my channel and hit that little notification bell if you're interested in learning about early music, or if you just love Baroque and Renaissance music as much as I do. And please give this video a like if you found the information useful or helpful, and leave me a comment below with any questions you might have. Thank you so much for watching.